So now to introduce our distinguished panel. Right next to me is Reza Ramazani. Reza was born in Iran and is an expert on international economics. Reza also received his PhD from the University of Colorado, so he's a fellow Buff.
Go Buffs!
Yeah. Next we have Henry Now. He's a distinguished expert on international economic affairs with a background in the Reagan administration. He's the originator of the American foreign policy theory, conservative internationalism. Next we have Heather Holbert. She's a senior advisor of the National Security Network in DC, an organization with the stated aim to build a strong, progressive national security and to counter conservative spin. And I would guess with that latter point, business has been pretty brisk lately. Lastly, we have Robert Kaufman, renowned for his expertise in foreign policy and international relations. I believe Robert will add some interesting perspectives to our panel today, as he's a staunch defender of the Bush Doctrine, a harsh critic of Obama's foreign policy, and has written some prominent articles in praise of Donald Trump's foreign policy moves. So that should be interesting. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Reza for some comments.
Good morning, folks. It's a pleasure to be back home. And I think as a graduate of this wonderful university, I have a home court advantage. That's the reason they asked me to go first. So, I want to start by saying there are some problem with trade, especially when we're trading with Chinese. China decided to become a member of a WTO in 2001, became a member of a Boys and Girls Club, big Boys and Girls Club. And when you become a member of a club, you have to follow all the rules, good, bad, and ugly, and you cannot do any cherry picking. So I totally agree that the Chinese are not following the international rule in some extent. For example, in order for American company to do business in China, they're forcing American company to transfer their technology. So if you're an American company and you want to do in business, you got to agree that you're going to transfer technology to Chinese. And when people in the US or other countries questioning the Chinese and say, look, you're breaking the rule, the response is, well, you know, we are not pointing a gun at them. You know, we ask them, you know, if you want to do business in our country, then you have to transfer the technology, and they do it by choice, which actually is really not the case, and I think is a type of extortion. That's, I think, one of the problems with the trade. I want to make it very clear at the outset. The second problem is Chinese have been producing a lot of products, including steel. They have an overcapacity. The economy is slowing down, so they're looking to sell some of the product to other countries like United States. And it is possible that in some cases they're selling their product below market price, or as some economists refer to it as dumping. The third problem, the potential problem, is some people accusing Chinese for manipulating their currency, which means artificially lowering the value of their currency in order to make their product cheaper and increase their export. So having said that, based on history, based on my humble experience as someone who has studied and researched international economics, trade war is not going to produce any positive result. We saw, the best example I can give you what happens in 1930 with the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. And I want to provide you with some numbers, hopefully some facts and not alternative facts, about why I take the position that the trade war is not going to produce any positive result for this country and also for China and or for a global economy, to be very honest with you. But at the same time, I think I'm rational. Yes, you can be an economist and a rational person at the same time. Those two are not mutually exclusive. But I want to be open-minded and rational, and if somebody provides me with some evidence, I'm happy to change my position. That's my job, actually, as a college professor. When my kids tell me, well, Reza, you're wrong, and this is evidence, I'll have to tell them, oh, I'm sorry, I'm going to change my position. So now, just about any measurement you're going to use, it doesn't matter what measurement, you know, the trade war appears to be a failure. Now, And also, we got to make sure to correct this misperception about trade. That if the country is running trade surplus, that country is winning. And if a country running a trade deficit, that country is losing. Trade is not zero-sum game. If we have a fair, yes, if we have a fair and free trade, all the participating are going to gain from the trade. Now, the administration is obsessed with the manufacturing job. And that's the reason the White House, when they talk about the trade deficit, they concentrate only on the trade of goods. But we also have a trade in goods and services, and we are running surplus in those areas. And the trade in services include banking, finance, and education. So I think they're very selective when they provide the information. For example, the goal or the purpose of a trade restriction, the tariffs on steel, was to reduce the size of a trade deficit. So this is the first number. Unfortunately, we don't have any evidence. Maybe it's going to happen later on. Maybe I'm rushing a little bit. But during the last year, 2018, the size of a trade deficit only in goods was $891 billion. Now, if we include the trade in goods and services, last year, the size of a trade deficit increased by $68 billion. So where is the meat? I haven't seen it yet. Now, let me give you a couple other numbers here, too. According to a study by Columbia University, the tariff cost American $3 billion extra in taxes per month and $1 billion in loss in economic efficiency. According to another study by World Bank, last year, the US economy lost $7.8 billion. But now we've got to put that number in perspective. I agree that is really not a huge number. $7.8 billion lost as a result of tariffs during the last year in 2018 is not that much, given the size of a US economy, which is a $19 trillion. Now, again, the true story. You got to say, to tell this the complete story, the good, bad, and the ugly. I totally agree that the administration achieved its objective by imposing tariff on steels, because this steel companies in the United States are doing very well, especially last year. Some steel companies increased their sale by 23%. And yes, they added 2,400 jobs. This is a very important piece of information. So yes, and again, I understand. I will do the same thing. When you're presenting your case, especially to the media, you're going to concentrate on the aspect of the issue that serve your purpose. And you praying to God that nobody from audience is going to ask you about the negative side, the unintended consequences of your policy, but I have to come clean. So yes, we achieve our objective, protecting some industry, steel industry. I gave you the number. You know, the sale went up last year by 23%, we create job, 2,400. But the devil is in detail. That was only 1% increase in job creation. But do you want to know how much, as an American, we're going to pay for every of those jobs we created? How much you think is going to cost us? For every job out of, for those 2,400, how much you think it cost us as an American? I'm going to take a nap. When you are ready, please wake me up. And as I tell my student, I want you to participate. I want you to talk, even if you're from Boston Garden and you talk funny like me. How about $650,000 per job? So I'll let you guys make a decision if you're winning or losing the trade war. Thank you.
Even on a snowy morning in Colorado, a good way to start a trade talk is to ask you to take a look at the labels of your clothing. Now, you've just put your clothing on. I'm not asking you to take your clothing off. But that would, I think, illustrate more than anything the importance of the topic we're talking about, because global trade has been an essential and very critical part of the post-war system that we created. And I want to make 3 points about that trading system. I'm going to give a little bit of the counterpart to Reza in the sense that he's dealt with the devil and the details. I want to deal with the design and with God, because I used to always say when I was in government, if the devil's in the details, then God must be in the design. Who has set this thing up? 3 points. Trade has been an enormous benefit for not only the United States, but for many, many other countries in the world since 1945. That's the good. You talked about the good, the bad, and the ugly. The bad is that it causes major disruptions. It costs jobs for workers who have to then move into alternative industries, alternative regions in order to keep their jobs. You know, if we were waking up on the morning of, 1947 or 1948, the center for manufacturing industry in the United States was in the Northeast. That's where all the major jobs were, manufacturing jobs. They have subsequently moved across the country and in many cases, of course, outside the country. This caused enormous disruption, all right, for the American worker. And that's the bad side, in some sense, at the ground level, where people are losing their jobs. And what has happened, I think, in recent decades, the last 2 decades, is that system has become overloaded. We've, number one, failed to recognize the sacrifice that workers have made. And we have stepped up the ante in terms of letting China into the trading system and basically opening our market widely to Chinese products. Now, many of those labels are going to show made in China. And that has caused a real problem. And my third point is going to be that Trump is addressing that problem. Unfortunately, previous presidents didn't address the problem of sort of a trade system that is overloaded, trade system that is good, but a trade system that's overloaded and the burdens on the American worker are simply too great, and they supported Trump in large numbers in 2016, and he has a very unconventional strategy for going about trying to change this situation. Let me just elaborate briefly on those 3 points. The benefits of trade. Income inequality has gone down dramatically in the world. That's a point we often don't hear, but it's true. That is, since 1945, America has pursued a trading policy, roughly a free trading policy, more or less, which has not only increased wealth, but spread wealth. And we have created an enormous middle class now in the globe as a whole. And of course, a stronger and stronger middle class in America. We're much wealthier today than we were 20 years ago, certainly than we were 50 years ago. So the benefits of trade are not just in material goods that we enjoy. It's also the fact that it's a great way to give opportunity to other countries to come into the system. And that has worked very, very well for the United States. It contributes then to peace in the world because other countries see the opportunity to get ahead without having to become belligerent and go to war. Now, the bad is, of course, that has created this disruption in our society. I would ask you to think about any other society whose workers would have been willing to do what the American worker was willing to do over the last 50, 60 years. I mean, take Japan, for example, or take China, or take even Germany. Which country would have put this kind of pressure on its workforce to move, find new jobs, because we're opening up our market to the manufacturing products, the clothing of other countries. We don't want to make those here anymore. We want to import them because they're cheaper from China. Now you, Mr. Worker, are going to have to go find a job someplace else. You're going to have to go into the service sector, or you're going to have to go to another manufacturing sector. What other country would have put that kind of a burden on their worker? Now, we did that naturally because our system is flexible, mobile. We've got an entrepreneurial system where people are out looking for ways to get ahead. And so it worked. And it worked in the end very well for the American worker, as well as for the foreign worker. All right? But we've overlooked, I think, many of the sacrifices that the American worker had to take. Let me just briefly on that second point of the bad. Think of what we've asked the American worker to do over the course of the last 50 years. All right, we've asked them not only to move and find new jobs as imports have flooded in, we've also asked them to adapt to a civil rights revolution, which dramatically changed our country, all for the better, but somebody had to make that adjustment, and the American worker was at the center of that. We've asked them to accommodate a wave of immigration, which is greater than it's ever been in the past, at least in absolute numbers. 59 million immigrants in the last 50 years. That's had an enormous impact on life in many parts of America, and it has affected the American worker. We've asked them to send their sons and daughters to police problems, military and conflicts around the world. And our forces, our soldiers, have died in greater proportion in the wars since 1945 than those of any other country, especially in the West. Now, that's a lot. And the American worker has finally said, oh, enough's enough. China, I think, was the straw that broke the camel's back, as Reza suggests. They're exploiting the rules, and they're flooding our markets. And the American worker finally said, look, I'm tired of it. I'm also tired of the immigration. We're going to have to do something about it. Now, Trump has come along, the ugly part. And he has decided, look, we're going to do something about this. We're going to rebalance, recalibrate these trade relationships. We signed these agreements 20, 30, 40 years ago. They're out of date. They need updating, and I want these allies and these other countries to know that now we're going to put our interests and our workers first. So he's renegotiating a whole set of agreements. He's doing this from very tough tactics, including, of course, increasing tariffs, which is kind of the equivalent of increasing your arms production if you're involved in a military conflict. And the tariffs are a problem if they stay on indefinitely. But he's doing that in order to get others to the attention of other countries, which other presidents have tried to do with nice talk. It hasn't worked. You're going to have to lay something on the line for them and tell them that they're going to pay a cost if they don't, in fact, aggressively negotiate with you on lowering tariffs. I can't be sure that Trump's ultimate objective is to bring tariffs down. I think he is a free trader. I base that, I can't prove it, but I base it on his comments several times over the last couple of years where he's told the allies, look, if you want to go to zero tariffs, I'll go to zero tariffs with you. Let's go. Let's get our negotiators together and we'll go. But now he's going to put some pretty tough terms on the table. And he's going to raise tariffs if they ultimately decide that they don't want to go in that direction. So whether it's a mistake or not, the jury is still out. He has renegotiated a South Korean agreement, which I think is a better agreement than the one we had. Now, you can get into those details if you wish. He's renegotiated NAFTA. All of these have to go through Congress, and that's going to be a very tough issue. He's negotiating with the European Union, with Japan, and ultimately with China. And China is the big kahuna. That's the big problem. If he can come up with an agreement that improves, to some extent, the monitoring of Chinese behavior and makes transparent when they are breaking the rules, and then have some real strict sanctions that are imposed, I think he will have made a tremendous contribution, and in the end it will have been, in fact, a good strategy to rebalance a trading system that's provided enormous benefits for much of the world as well as for America.
Thanks, and thanks so much for inviting me to be on this panel. The last time I was invited any place to talk about trade, it was a windowless basement in the US Congress, and I was looking out at the terrified faces of about 15 junior congressional staff who had all been given the trade portfolio for the first time. And they all looked at it as an opportunity where basically they could easily mess up and get their boss in trouble, but they were they were really having a hard time seeing how they could do anything productive. And so it was my job to change their mind. This feels like a much easier assignment this morning. Now, the reason for that actually makes this a really fun conversation to have in a freewheeling environment like CWA, where I'm not representing anybody but myself, is that actually opinion on this doesn't break down along party lines. And frankly, neither party really has a settled idea of what it's supposed to think or say on these issues. And so that, if you work for someone in politics, that's a minefield and you're likely to get in trouble. If you are a free radical, that's a lot of fun. So So I want to start by saying that I agree with everything that Reza said, and I agree with a lot of what Henry said, and have some also sort of significant, like minor sounding, but really significant disagreements that I'll try to spotlight a little bit, just because I think it's a useful way to help us think about what are the policy choices that we have in front of us, and what you should be. So when you listen to political leaders and candidates who I've just told you are all terrified of this issue, what you should be listening for. So Henry has laid out, actually in terms that people were very afraid to use before the Trump campaign, sort of a history of both what was so great about the trading system and what's so problematic about it. And I think the really interesting thing is that case is even stronger if you say like two things differently from what you did, Henry, which is that income inequality between countries has decreased. And that's actually an enormous achievement. And it's really interesting. And frankly, it's an achievement that progressives like me should trumpet more. That there is a much bigger global middle class. And a lot of that has to do with countries being able to export their products to the United States. But what has increased rather than decreased is income inequality within countries. And so in that sense, you all know the numbers about the American middle class being smaller and under threat and not gaining ground nearly as quickly as the 1% and the 0.01%? 0.1%? The real economist on the panel, I'm a little nervous about this. And it is interesting that we can, from that, not just in the US, this phenomenon is, you see it also in Western Europe and in some other places, the rage that people feel, even when they didn't know the numbers, about the idea that, you know, a generation ago, a worker in Michigan could get out of high school, get a job in a plant, and save enough money to buy a vacation home or a boat, or go on or save up to retire in Florida and send it was usually his children to college. And that is unimaginable now in our industrial economy, or let's be honest, the vast majority of our service economy. And when you combine that rage with something which we can politely call cultural anxiety, as Henry referred to it, and somewhere it shades from cultural anxiety over into racism, xenophobia, and sexism, but cultural anxiety is a perfectly legitimate way to talk about it. Then you have this place where trade becomes not just about the movement of goods and services, but about who are we and what kind of country are we, which is one of the reasons that it's so poisonous and hard to talk about, because very often when we talk about trade, we're not talking about the numbers that Reza mentioned. We're talking about how we feel about interacting with the rest of the world. And there's really interesting polling data that shows that if you ask people how they feel about trade, even more than if they've personally lost a job to outsourcing, is how they feel about relating to people who are different from them, how they feel about cultural pluralism. So that is one of the many things that really bedevils coming to good policy outcomes on this issue. Now, then it also makes this issue important in a way that maybe you weren't anticipating hearing me talk about, because one of the things that happens when your middle class feels under threat, feels alienated, feels like it doesn't have a voice anymore, is that trust in democracy declines. And trust in democratic institutions decline, and willingness to go for fringe solutions that say, democratic rules and norms, they're not that important, because what have they delivered for you? You know, did they save your middle class lifestyle in Ohio? Did they keep your auto plant open? No, they didn't. So you don't need those democratic norms and values. And that, again, is a development that you see across societies. It's not unique to the US, but it's obviously, you know, even if you're one of those liberals who says, oh, those people, the hell with them. Even if you don't care about those folks, which you should really care about the decline in trust in our institutions. Okay, now the really bad news is that was the easy part of the conversation. Because then the question arises, what do you do? So you have this problem where we have built a trading system that does accrue tremendous net wealth to the United States. The graphs you learned in your 3 economics courses are still true, but we're not spreading out those gains very well. We haven't really figured out, well, we haven't tried spreading them out. So then the question is, what is a way that will actually work, number one, and can actually be gotten through our political system, number two, to spread them out? So I think Henry gave the most positive case that you could give for what this administration is trying to do. And, you know, if it works, okay, that'll be really interesting. My skepticism about it comes from he hasn't actually gotten a deal through Congress yet. The South Korea deal is a sort of an adjustment on a deal that the Obama administration negotiated. So when we see USMCA pass through Congress, or if we actually see, I mean, I don't think you're going to see a deal with the European Union in the next 5 years for reasons that are actually not primarily Trump's fault. I don't know how you negotiate with the EU right now. But I don't see this process actually leading to more cohesion in the international trade system. I see it leading to less cohesion. Meanwhile, we're also doing things like not appointing judges to the World Trade Organization, so the system as set up can't function. So then, but that leads us to another question, which is, are we actually negotiating trade deals that are going to help the people we say we want to help? And I'm sure Reza will have better numbers on this than I do, but for jobs gained in the steel industry, we are losing jobs in the auto industry. We had record numbers of agricultural bankruptcies last year as farmers can't sustain the dips and rises in prices. Even crazy things like the beer industry, because guess what? If you make aluminum more expensive, guess what comes in aluminum? So as you both mentioned, there are unintended consequences, and this is the other thing that administrations of both parties have been totally guilty of. There are intended consequences. When you choose which industries you're putting tariffs on, and I'm going to criticize Democrats for a minute here, just for fun, when you choose which industries you're going to protect in the Trans-Pacific Partnership and which industries you're not going to protect, you're picking who benefits and who doesn't. And that's okay. I mean, we pretend that doesn't happen, but it might be better to be honest and say it does happen. And when you, as a voter, are choosing your representatives, you need to be able to choose who are they helping and who do I think they should be helping. And to have that kind of conversation, which then leads you into the dread territory where these guys get to accuse me of being socialist, the question of, see, I'm so nice, I'm like telling them how to do it. The question of,
I don't need help.
Do you want to have an industrial policy? Do you want to say, we explicitly want to support these kinds of industries, and so we're going to work on their behalf in trade deals? Or we've explicitly written off these industries, and so therefore we're going to give them away to help out other countries. And those are the kinds of questions that we're going to have to talk about in economic policy in the future. And frankly, where I think Henry sketched this out really, really well, the years where we were so much bigger than everybody else, we could be the world consumer of last resort, we didn't have to deal with these difficult trade-offs within our domestic interests, or we could keep saying a tide will eventually lift all boats. I want to make one quick last point. And because I think this is something we don't talk about expressly enough. So on the one hand, $650,000 a worker might sound unacceptably high. Then if you think about what are other ways we have to bring good jobs back to communities, and what are other ways we have to bring not just a bump for 6 or 12 months or a one-time bump sale in corn and soybeans to China that's conveniently going to happen before the 2020 elections. Hello, trade deal with China. How much would it cost? You know, think about a community that you know near you that's been really hit by some combination of trade and automation. How much would it cost to bring back dignified livelihoods and commerce to that community? How much do you think it's worth per person? And then, so that's one question. And then, ideologically and practically, do you want to do it through tariffs? Do you want to do it through trade adjustment assistance, which is the way we used to say that we did it until the 2000s when we quit even trying to do it? Do you want to do it through jobs programs? Do you want to do it through industrial policy? Do you want to do it through attacking monopolies and breaking up big banks and trying to stimulate bottom-up capitalism here in the U.S.? And so then, you know, based on which way you want to try to do it, That's how your trade deals and your international economic policy fit with rebuilding both community security in the US and the most fundamental sense of democratic security in which we trust and believe in our government to deliver for us.
Free trade is good. We've benefited enormously from a freer international system. We don't want to go back to the 1930s when trade wars contributed significantly to the atmosphere that culminated in the most destructive war in history. The United States wisely, beginning with Franklin Roosevelt and Churchill during World War II, followed on by the Truman administration after World War II, encouraged an international system promoting freer trade on the theory that that would contribute significantly to prosperity and political stability. In an act of enlightened self-interest that I think is unparalleled, the United States was willing in constructing that international system to practice free trade in a more unrestrained way than those countries participating in the system. And for a long period of time, that made sense because after World War II, we emerged largely unscathed, and the world needed the United States to adopt for a period of time what was an asymmetric policy where we were more open to the trade of other countries than they were to our trade. So all of that is wise. That policy of the United States unilaterally being the most consistent free trader, which made sense at the time, has to be readjusted. And there are really two positions on this, and I'm under contract to write a book on Trump's foreign policy, and I think the jury is out on this. I would like to agree with Henry, and I'm inclined to agree with Henry. Is Donald Trump putting pressure on Europe and China in particular as a way in which to make those countries abide by free trade? Is his threat of tariffs a tactical way of opening these other countries, or is Trump a doctrinal free trader? And if you look at the composition of the Trump administration, there are two Trumps. If you're an optimist, and I am more along the lines of Henry on this, and you're making the case that Trump is using the threat of tariffs in order to open up the Germans who are taking advantage of us. There's no reason why the Germans should restrict American access given the robustness of our economy. This is not 1945. If you believe that Trump is a tactical user of tariffs in order to promote genuinely freer and fairer trade, you'd look to Larry Kudlow, who is advising Trump and is a doctrinaire free market person. If you are skeptical about whether Trump is a doctrinal free, restricted, managed trade person, there's evidence for that. I think it's less strong, but it's serious. Peter Navarro, who is an advisor to Trump at a high level, is a doctrinal protectionist. So I think the evidence is mixed on that. I think overall, I think the evidence is stronger for Henry's position, but the concerns that people are raising that Trump may actually be a doctrinal protectionist are things that you can't dismiss, not only based on the composition of the Trump administration, but actually Trump's history himself. Now, I'm ready to invite scorn. That's my role here. I relish it. But having read Trump's 7 books for this book I'm writing, and you say, why would you do that? And the reason is because it actually provides some clues about some basic instincts that Trump has that are fairly consistent. Trump has a nostalgic view of the United States in the 1950s. Big government, big labor, big companies, the dominance of the American auto industry. That makes Trump at least susceptible to the notion that we should be protectionist in order to restore that world of the 1950s. There is other evidence as well. I think on balance, and I know people don't think he has one, but if you want to appeal to the case that Trump is actually using pressure as a tactic, Larry Kudlow is the better angel of his nature. And something else, we have complained really for decades that the international trading system, especially if you are a free trader, needs adjustment. It's no longer valid for the European Union to restrict our goods in a way that we don't restrict theirs. It's not 1945. These countries have recovered. I also think that you have to look at Trump's policy toward China, his trade policy toward China, not in isolation, but as part of a broader strategic judgment that I agree with. Even though on the particulars of trade, I think the one misstep that Trump has made on this is his rejection of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Heather said something nice about Republicans, so I'm going to say something nice. I'm going to say something nice about Obama. It's not easy. Hold on, Heather.
Bob, I gotta remind you they're videotaping
I
this
know.
session. Be careful what you're going to say.
I know. I think.
And I hope you're drinking water this morning, nothing else.
I think you got to get smelling salts because Heather here is having a hot flash. But here are the two things. One, Obama was right to give the Presidential Medal of Freedom to the greatest basketball player of all time, who played for the greatest team of all time, Bill Russell of the Boston Celtics. Secondly, Obama was right about the Trans-Pacific Partnership to encourage broader and freer trade among a coalition of states excluding China that made economic and strategic sense. And Trump's rejection of the Trans-Pacific Partnership actually works against his broader strategy that I agree with on alerting the world, and I think we've been asleep at the wheel, both political parties, on the growing danger of Chinese ambitions that has a trade dimension, an economic dimension, and a military dimension. Simply put, China is, according to the Trump administration's 2018 national security document, James Mattis's, and according to people like Michael Pillsbury and Adam Friedberg and Gordon Chang and people like me, China is not seeking stability, but seeking to supplant the United States to achieve hegemony, inimical to the legitimate interests of our allies in the United States in the most important geopolitical region of the 21st century. Well, Europe was to world politics in the 20th century. East Asia is to the 21st century. And Trump's emphasis on Chinese predatory economic behavior, which runs across the board, including intellectual property, contributes significantly to alerting the American people to the gathering danger of a Chinese regime that's increasingly illiberal, authoritarian, and expansionist. And if you don't believe me, take a look at the New York Times in April of 2013 that did the country an enormous public service, providing a link to something called Chinese Document Number 9, the directive that this current Chinese dictator sent to his Politburo, describing Western freedom in general and the United States in particular as the existential barrier to Chinese ambitions. And finally, Trump's emphasis on Chinese predatory behavior has also contributed indirectly but significantly to improving and deepening and broadening our relations with a decent democratic India that has a prime minister who shares our outlook on China, capitalism, Islamic radicalism, and has the added bonus of being pro-Israel besides. The jury is still out on this one about whether Trump is a doctrinal or a tactical user of tariffs. But I do think that the current system where the United States is the only country abiding by free trade is politically, economically, and strategically untenable. So we should wish Trump well on this one because the alternatives aren't sustainable either.
Thank you very much. That was all really good stuff. So I have a question here from the audience about, since we were on the topic of the Obama administration and just kind of the Democrat line and the media in general, about manufacturing jobs. When they're lost, the response was those jobs are not coming back. Hillary Clinton said we're going to put a lot of coal miners out of business, and other types of things where there's articles written about, manufacturing, people who lose their jobs, they should learn to code. How much do you think the Trump administration's position on trade and the trade deficit and how that relates to manufacturing jobs is somewhat of a natural political reaction and response that's really somewhat logical to what could be conceived of as a cruel reaction to someone losing their job and not knowing what they're going to do to support themselves and their family? And do you think that line of thinking has credence?
I'd be happy to answer that question, or at least start. But before I start that question, I want to say I am so hopeful about the future of this country. If Heather can say something nice about Robert Kaufman, and Robert Kaufman can say something nice about Heather.
I hate being in this position, so I'm just tempted to take it back.
Mr. Kaufman, I have a bad news for you. The damage is done. It's too little, too late. You're on the record now.
Don't rub it in.
Now, I'm an equal opportunity abuser when it comes to politician, with all due respect. I'm from Vermont, and I want to make sure that I'm not taking side, that, okay, I'm a Republican, Democrat, or progressive. I have a strong position. I am not a citizen of this country, so people cannot accuse me being belong to the right or the left or the progressive or the middle. But I agree with this statement because during the last election, all the three candidates, Trump, Bernie Sanders, God bless him, and Mrs. Clinton, played with people's emotion, especially people they lost their job in manufacturing. They went around the country, and I remember vividly, especially in Michigan, all three of them promised that when they're elected, they're going to bring those jobs back. I totally agree with Henry about American workers making a lot of sacrifices, losing their job. I understand about the dislocation of American workers. But I think it's not fair to blame all the misery that American workers are facing, number one, to international trade, and number two, to immigrants who come to this country. That might be part of it, and that's what I'm talking about, So when we present our case, I think and I do it all the time. I do it, I'm as bad as everybody else. We have a tendency to exaggerate a little bit. So I'm not gonna deny that international trade and immigration has some impact on this location of American workers and losing their job. But one thing we are forgetting, or we are not mentioning it, how about the role of a technology? The economy is evolving. The economy is changing, The role of a technology. Now, you cannot drive Miss Daisy to a particular location. There was a session, and now we have a driverless car, and we have trucks that drive itself. A lot of American truck drivers are going to lose their job. I think that's one of the factors. So the role of artificial intelligence, even at the colleges and universities, now we are trying to substitute technology for people like me, and I can feel the pressure. Given my age, some people in my college tell me, Reza, when are you planning to retire? I tell them, you'll be the first one to find out when I decided to retire. And I understand. Colleges and universities, especially small liberal colleges in New England, under pressure to cut costs. So what they want to do, they want to offer most of their courses online, so they don't need the ugly old professor like me. And again, it's a very cost-effective. So we gotta be careful. Yes, I agree why some Americans lost their job, especially, but those manufacturing jobs are really not coming back. Part of it because of the technology.
But part of this problem also is that if you look, and I think Henry's right, the most egregious problem on this is China. China is behaving in a predatory way. They steal our intellectual property. Now, if you think this is just a conservative issue and not a general issue, think again. Our Constitution wisely, in Article 1, thought intellectual property and creativity was so important. We're the only constitution in the world that provides protection for that, even before the First Amendment in our Constitution. And if you think it's just a Republican political point, again, think again. I live in Malibu. I'm at Pepperdine. I know a lot of these music guys, and I've been a consultant to them. And one of the reasons is the publishing companies in music and the movies understand, and they are being robbed, and creative people and practical people are being robbed by this type of predatory behavior where people are stealing our intellectual property and undermining the incentives for creativity and innovation that benefits everybody. So even if you don't want a trade war, you have to ask yourself the question. We have tried. The theory was if China became a partner in the WTO, they'd have a stake in the system. It hasn't turned out that way. If you're a free trader, philosophically, and I am, and it seems that everybody here is, how do you react when you're dealing with a situation when you're the only one playing by the rules, and it has tremendously difficult social consequences? And secondly, and I think Republicans have tin ears on some things, but Hillary Clinton's tin ear really hurt her. That remark, deplorable, really cost her the election. There are many points. I advise you all to read the book by Vance, Hillbilly Elegies. And by the way, it's by no means uncritical assessment, but I think you have to understand how red state America thinks, especially if you disagree with it. And a lot of things you should disagree with before you can think through the politically feasible way of addressing these problems. It's not sufficient to dismiss these people. These are serious, legitimate concerns where their answers may not be right all the time, but the concerns they raise are serious and they can't be dismissed. And if we do dismiss them, we're going to contribute to the wave, and it's not just an American wave, of populist reaction that is going to react against what they perceive to be an elite, out-of-touch view that doesn't take their interests serious. Again, taking the interest seriously doesn't mean agreeing with it, but Henry is right. We have to at least address seriously the legitimate feelings of American workers who believe that since World War II, they've carried a lot of water and it's time for some reciprocity.
So if I can, again, jump in and half agree and half disagree, but first I'm going to make some additional reading recommendations. If you either already read J.D. Vance or sort of find yourself wondering if there's a little more to the story, there's a wonderful book that's either called What You Are Getting Wrong About Appalachia or What They Are Not Telling You About Appalachia. I'm sorry, I'm not remembering. So maybe somebody can Google it. I was going to not be impolite and Google it in front of you. And there's also a wonderful Appalachian essayist and writer named Monica Potts. And like with so many things, if you read a couple things together, you get a really interesting and nuanced picture. My favorite part of the Vance book is actually his trying to learn which fork to use at dinners at Harvard Law School. Yale Law School, I'm so sorry. Someone will, now I'm really, never mind disagreeing with you if I mistake Harvard and Yale Law Schools. So point I want to really pull out and stress is that this exact same thing has happened across Europe. So it is not, in fact, the case that Hillary Clinton was somehow a uniquely awful candidate in the history of the world who caused this to happen. So point one. And point two is I have a really serious question for my fellow panelists, which is I have a sneaking suspicion that neither President Obama's policies, had they been continued, nor President Trump's policies, is going to convince China that it should be a good citizen. You're nodding. And so, to my mind, we face a longer-term choice that is actually even quite a bit more challenging than the one that appears to be presented to us currently, which is we have this major player in the system that wants to rewrite the rules to suit itself, and in East Asia, frankly, has the economic power to do so. Now, one of the reasons that I find the president's approach more concerning than Henry and Bob do is that if you think that you can't actually get China to be a long-term actor that plays by the rules, then you have, I think you have two choices. Maybe there are other choices it would be good if there were. One of them is that you really try to build up the strongest possible relationship with Europe that you can. And you really try to build sort of a globalization 2.0, a globalization of democracies that then can compete with Chinese-led sort of power-based rather than rules-based globalization. The trick about that, as you said, and which is absolutely true, is that the Europeans are a real bear to negotiate with. They are not interested in giving ground on a number of issues that are really important to our business and our workers. And your stereotype of Europeans as lovely and cuddly and more progressive than us is wrong on trade issues. So, so that one's going to be hard. And you talk to trade negotiators and they really start growling at you when you mention doing deals with Europe because it's difficult. Now, the alternative is a kind of autarkic world where the US dominates the Western Hemisphere. And some people, if they look at some of the things that are in the MCA, the way the president did it, and some of the president's rhetoric, and as you said, the rhetoric of some of his advisors, think that ultimately that's where he's going, and he wants us to live in kind of a retrenched Western Hemisphere world, which is maybe not that great for our economy in the long run, and particularly maybe not that great for the tech sector, which, love it or hate it, is really the engine of our economy right now. And maybe that also implies some really different things about global security and about sort of how we think about rights and outlooks. But once you acknowledge that maybe we can't actually get the Chinese to live by the rules, then you do have to start thinking about these other choices and thinking about what are the security and economic steps you take to get you ready to live in one of those worlds.
Yeah, except, Heather, that's actually not what Trump is doing. I will tell you from the mouth of John Bolton and Jim Mattis directly, Trump's alternative is different. What the Trump administration's primary goal is to create a value-based democratic alliance system in the Indo-Pacific that includes Japan, South Korea, and India as the linchpin to adopt some version of vigilant containment toward China. So there is absolutely zero support in the Trump administration from the horse's mouth for an America First retrenchment to the Western Hemisphere. Quite the contrary. Miles Yu and Michael Pillsbury, the two pillars on China, and Gordon Chang III, I'm going to a conference in D.C. on April 8th with the Trump people who are going to be there at Hoover, Victor Davis Hansen's military conference. You may not like that option either, but the Trump administration's strategy isn't Fortress America, but vigilant containment based on a value-based alliance system, underwritten by enhanced, much more robust deterrence, which is why he has committed us, rightly or wrongly, to a substantial military buildup.
I would, make, I think, one critical point here. If Heather's right, and there's a chance that she may be, that is, that China is not going to reach agreement with us, then we're heading for a world, both of our options would be worlds in which growth would be slower. We would have, therefore, more problems with immigration, more problems in the security area. It's not a very happy prospect to look for. Here's the reason why I think China is likely to make a deal. They, in the end, are far more dependent upon this global economy than we are. We could at least sustain ourselves through a community of democracies or through a Western Hemispheric strategy because we have big markets and we are used to dealing with the world through the global economy. The Chinese have just been at this for a few decades. 3 decades ago, they were an impoverished country. They have made the progress they have made largely on the strength of their participation in the global economy. The industries in China that are doing really well are those that are totally dependent upon exports. The ones that don't do any exporting are in trouble. They're piling up all kinds of bad debts and products that nobody wants. So China faces a choice. It is going to either eventually accept alternative terms for their participation in the global market and do basically what all other market countries do, that is respect each other's intellectual property laws, or it's going to have to clamp down. It's going to grow much less than it has. In fact, may not grow at all. It's going to have to confront these huge debts that the state-owned, domestic-oriented industries have, and it's going to face even more potential political unrest at home. Now, Xi may be anticipating this. I mean, he has been cracking down like crazy in the last 5 years on the political system. So if, China's, we have to look at this sometimes not just from the standpoint of U.S. interests, but also China's interests. And I think in the end, China is going to make a deal. Now, if Trump is good enough to keep them guessing as to whether or not he'll accept the world of higher tariffs, which is really going to hurt their growth prospects, and uses that leverage to get them to make some commitments. If he's good at keeping them confused, if he's good at keeping the opponents, his opponents here domestically, confused about what his ultimate objective is, he's also very good at keeping both Bob and me confused when we are trying to support him. So, but that may be his strength in the sense that if the Chinese can't figure him out and really are worried that they could go back to a world of tariffs and much slower growth for them, that's the basis on which they will come to the table and make an acceptable agreement. And there's enough evidence. Trump ran a company which had a brand. He branded his own company with his own name. He knows the service sector from practical experience in the world, and he knows very well that he couldn't have done what he did as a businessman if he had not had access to the global economy. So I really doubt that he is the kind of protectionist that Peter Navarro is, and that he is going to wind up accepting a much more protectionist world.
God help me for saying this, but I think I agree with Heather again on one point. Henry, I hope you're right. Wouldn't it be nice if you're right? And I think you make a very good rational argument about what the Chinese should do under Deng Xiaoping. They would have done it. One thing in our focus on Trump's irrationalities is the assumption that the rest of the world is rational and it's just Trump. If you look at the trajectory of Chinese politics over the past 6 years, they're not moving in a capitalist or open direction. This is a true believer, and if you look at the way he thinks and the way he's consolidated his power, and I think his overestimation of Chinese strength and American weakness, I'm not sure, and I think it is more likely, although I'd be happy to be wrong, that Heather's right that we are going to face, one way or another, this stark choice. And one way to address it is I think, a strategy of more vigilant containment, and then there's an engagement strategy. But I hope you're right, but here I'm going to depart with you on your optimism about a Chinese leadership. Even though I think your logic is sound, I think it's unreasonable to think that the Chinese are necessarily rational. And I hope you're right and I'm wrong about that.
Well, now is a good point to kind of dovetail in with an audience question from a student regarding trade policy, specifically with China, as a guise for national security interests and policies, specifically with the company Huawei and their products being essentially embargoed and banned from certain aspects from the United States, and we're trying to put pressure on Europe to not accept those products as well as they relate to 5G, military communication, and things of that nature. So how much of this is not about American jobs and how much of this is about national security on our potential collision course with China as world powers?
Lots.
The U.S. doesn't have a 5G corporation, so it's actually not, like, this one is really not about American jobs. We might all four of us agree on that one, if y'all are ready for that.
We do.
So it's really, I'll say several things I think we all agree with, and then one where we all disagree, just in case y'all are getting bored. So it's really not about American jobs. Actually, the countries that should stand to benefit are Sweden's Ericsson and Finland's Nokia. It's an interesting and ironic and sad question that they may actually not be geared up to benefit But so that's point one. Point two, something where not so much a disagreement as some skepticism. It's an interesting, I mean, nobody disputes, and by the way, this is true of American telecoms too, there are former Chinese Intel people on very senior levels of every Chinese telecom company. And it is also totally clear that they have much closer relationships, that companies are built with sort of explicit knowledge and understanding of the Chinese military intelligence apparatus. And whether it takes the form of a formal sort of constructed back door, where anytime they want, the Chinese government can peek into your Huawei phone, or whether it takes the form of there is in fact no backdoor, but the folks who built the software know how to go in and use the system to, say, knock out your router anytime they feel like knocking out your router. This is a real issue. But it's not going over that well, as folks may have noticed, and as the questioner seems to have, with even our closest allies, who the Brits have built an astonishing amount of their government telecom system around Huawei. So this, to me, points out sort of two things. One is, when you hear something like what Bob, you said about building an alternative Indo-Pacific security system, India, Japan, South Korea, those countries are not going to be able to divorce their economies from China. When we try to pull away, they are not going to be able to come with us, and so you're going to be stuck in this uncomfortable place, as in the Huawei case, where the security arrow points one way, the economic arrow points another way. It's very unclear who will win. And then this leads me to my last point, which is that the behavior of this administration and the throwing around threats and unilateral actions on all kinds of issues, it's a little bit like the boy who cried wolf. Oh, you dumped tariffs on us over this, and now you want us to stop using Huawei? Like, why? You're just, how do we differentiate which one of these is play acting and which one is for real? And we can't tell which one is, frankly, we can't tell which one is more important to you, so we're just going to stiff arm you. And that's the real cost. The Huawei is a great example of the cost of the Trump modality of doing business, in my view.
Well, it's a tough problem, though. I mean,
It is a tough problem.
if you're right, Heather, that China is not likely to make a deal, and we have the alternative of working with the European Union or other democracies, or of retreating to this hemisphere, I mean, you just suggested that the European countries may not be willing to cooperate. They may decide that they'd rather work with China. That's an even worse sort of outcome than you can imagine. So I don't want to go down that road. I want to assume that we're going to be able to break this thing, and we're going to get an acceptable agreement. I mean, we're not going to get a perfect agreement. If Trump follows through, as he has in the other agreements, he's sunsetting all of these agreements. That is, they all come up for renegotiation in 5 or 6 years. He'll probably do the same thing with the Chinese. And boy, I think we better hope that that works. And, you know, there are serious security issues involved in all of this, and we're only starting to grapple with these, also in the broader context of cyber warfare. I think we're going to manage that problem. I'm pretty confident about it. I don't think they're going to be the Russian troll shops and the Chinese, institutes that are dedicating themselves to this, that somehow or other these centrally directed organizations are going to do any better in a future conflict that might involve cyber warfare than they were in the Cold War. They're going to cause some real problems. We're going to have to really go to the mat with them in terms of strengthening our own capacities in this region. We're going to have to consider the possibility of deterrence in cyber warfare. That is, where we get aggressive, we take offensive actions, or at least be prepared to take offensive actions against their facilities. And that's all just we're in the early stages. I kind of compare it to the late 40s, early 50s, when we were trying to figure out how we were going to handle nuclear technology in terms of containing and relating to other countries around the world. I'm not in any way pessimistic about our ability to win that challenge. Now, what you want to try to do is preserve peace in the meantime and let the real differences in your domestic systems come out the way they did eventually in the Cold War. And one side had to basically capitulate because their domestic system couldn't tolerate the competition. So I'm just thinking that we've got it. I'm optimistic on both ends. That is, I think China is going to, in fact, agree to an acceptable arrangement. And if they don't, I think we're in a great position to ultimately, in the long run, manage this transition into the next phase of technological innovation.
I think very quickly, I think the objective of a trade war with China, according to this administration, is mainly to get rid of a trade deficit, to encourage or force Chinese to buy more from us. And we buy less from them. And I might be missing something, because there is not very clear objective as how this country want to deal with the biggest problem that we have with Chinese, and that's transfer of technology. And I don't think Chinese are willing or probably able, to solve that problem in near future.
Okay, well, thank you very much. On that note, we're out of time. I just want to thank our panelists. It was wonderful. We could talk about this a lot longer. And thank you to the audience for being here as well. Thank you.
We keep
Really
this up, and we might
Be
have
honest
to put
with
her
you.
up as our candidate.